Adversaries are relentless, and they're only getting smarter, faster, and more sophisticated. Knowing their game is the only way to beat them. That's why we're here. Learn what it takes to protect against even the most sophisticated attacks. Welcome to the Adversary Universe podcast.
Wow, had some internet issues today.
Yeah.
And I was yelling at my router. I was yelling at it.
Something you weren't supposed to, or was it taken over by a Chinese orb botnet?
You know, probably, more than likely.
Did you update your router? Is it? It's time for us to remind everybody. Make sure you update your router and go through all the systems you're managing. Do a little.
That's a good point. Yeah.
apt-get update or whatever your preferred flavor of updating is.
Don't know what's happening in your home network? The Adversary does.
We got some cool swag from Falcon too.
We do, yeah, exactly. We have hats. If you haven't checked out the CrowdStrike swag store, actually, there you go. There's our first sponsor. Brought to you by the CrowdStrike swag shop. Go to CrowdStrikeSwag.com and get your latest CrowdStrike gear, including apparel, drinkware, accessories, and adversary figurines. Brought to you by Counter Adversary Operations.
My new favorite is the children's book, A is for Adversary. That was debuted at Falcon this year, and also an adversary coloring book for the little ones, too.
You know what? That was really, really good, actually. A is for Adversary. By the way, for those of you listening that think this is a joke, it's actually not a joke. If you go to CrowdStrikeSwag.com, you'll actually see A is for Adversary, a book that is there to inspire the next generation of cybersecurity leaders. It's brought to you by a lot of the work that Adam's team has done, right? Mm-hmm. On CAO, and it's an engaging ABC guide that combines some really playful storytelling and some awesome hand-drawn illustrations and some cyber safety tips, and it's fun for the whole family, and I think it's definitely worth picking up. People were going insane for that. I think it's sold out, right, at the conference.
B is for botnet, which is what's running on Christian's router right now.
So let's get into this episode for today.
Let's get into it.
Yeah, we're doing a bit of a history lesson, right? Kind of a history of ransomware. We have a write-up that we published back in 2022 around the history of ransomware first observation. As I started digging into kind of the evolution of ransomware turning into like ransomware as a service and cryptocurrencies being used as a payment mechanism to fulfill those ransom demands, I almost forgot. I read the story, I was like, man, you know what? I almost forgot about the old 1980s Trojan, right? That was used in the WHO, the WHO. Right, it was like an AIDS Trojan that was basically a floppy. Yeah, exactly. And I thought it was so fascinating that this all started out way back in the day, where a piece of ransomware was delivered like on floppy.
Yeah, right? But there's no way to really like get the money. You know, it was like send a
check. It was like
PO box type of thing.
Yes, exactly. It was like send this money order of like $190 or something, or $189. The PC Cyborg. It was a PC Cyborg virus. That's what it was.
Oh, is that what it was?
Yeah. Back in 1989 on floppy. And he was asking for $189.
That's big money back then in 1989.
Yeah, seriously, per I think it was either you get like it was like a half license for $189 or like the that for like a full license. And there's a PO box that was set up in Panama where you had to send this payment to. Can you imagine waiting weeks for your system to be decrypted?
No,
right? Yeah.
And then you get a floppy disk, yeah.
You get a floppy disk with like the keys, right? With the symmetric.
The early days of viruses were weird. Remember the Michelangelo virus where it was
Michelangelo virus, that's right.
March 13th, 1994, and you had to set your PC ahead of days.
That's right.
Virus.
That's amazing.
I think that's how McAfee actually, John McAfee,
that's right.
Today, right? That's how he launched his product, was kind of in the run up to that or the heels of that. I forgot which, but. Yeah. But yeah, then, speaking of antivirus, that was kind of the transition point to modern ransomware. Was kind of fake AV was a thing for a while.
That's right. I do remember that whole campaign. Yeah.
Yeah, people would buy fake AV and that was credit card payments. So that was kind of, they thought they were actually buying something, which is, I think, how they were able to get those credit card payments to process.
Yeah.
But it wasn't really a big thing until the advent of cryptocurrency. I think when Bitcoin hit the scene, it was 2008 was Bitcoin. When Bitcoin first came out, it was kind of very novel. You might remember somebody bought the first thing that anybody bought. Do you know what it was with Bitcoin?
Pizza, right?
Yeah.
Was it pizza? Yeah. How much did they pay?
100 Bitcoin, I think it was.
No.
Mm-hmm.
100 Bitcoin?
100 Bitcoin.
That is the most expensive pizza ever. Like that should get a Guinness World Record.
Well, yeah, because that's what would that be today in cryptocurrency? That would be like
I think in like 10
11
million.
million
11,
dollars
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's insane.
in pizza. That person better have enjoyed those pizzas. Hopefully it wasn't some like budget pizza. It
Yeah,
was like,
seriously. Hopefully they got some premium toppings and not just
yeah,
pepperoni.
they got the sausage and pepperoni.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, so cryptocurrency kind of changed the entire game for ransomware, right?
Yeah, I mean, the first real modern one was part of Game Over Zeus, I think, was the first one that I really remember.
Yeah, Game Over Zeus was CryptoLocker, actually.
Okay, yeah, so it's
Yeah, Game Over
CryptoLocker.
Zeus was CryptoLocker back in 2013.
Yeah, so with Game Over Zeus, the thing about that was it was really focused on wire fraud. They
Mm-hmm.
went after ACH, which was account clearinghouse, where you could do a lot of large wire transfers out of that. That was their bread and butter.
Yeah.
And then if they couldn't get what they needed, in terms of ACH when they got onto an infected machine, then they would go and start targeting bank account information, credit card information, and then the last ditch effort, if they wanted to wring that last couple of potential dollars out of an infection, was they would deploy crypto locker, and that would lock the system. And there was also kind of a bit of a brief period before that where there was kind of these screen lockers that would be out there.
Yeah, that's
You
right.
didn't actually encrypt your system; it just locked your screen, so
Yeah.
you could either pay them money or hit Alt
Like a
F4.
password protected screensaver, essentially, right?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Yeah. That's
Yeah,
fascinating.
Yeah, and then Crypto Locker came out, and that got disrupted. Actually, CrowdStrike worked on that back in, I think it was 2015 when that all went down, and disrupted Game Over Zeus in concert with Shadow Server and all these other vendors that were out there, and DOJ.
Yeah, yeah.
It was a global effort, and after that, then I think Crypto Wall came out. And that was something that was going around for a while as well. But both of those early ransomwares, they targeted home users. I used to joke at the time that it would be like, I always thought about my dad. He would have a problem with Google, and then he would Google and call whatever number came up.
Oh.
I always joke that I can't imagine what these poor e-crime guys were going through trying to like talk, some
Elderly person that's not like computer savvy.
A baby boomer through like first you have to get cryptocurrency and then you have to go on tour, and like they probably lost money on
Yeah,
the amount
exactly.
of time they spent trying to do that.
That's funny.
But the first real one that kind of hit was something called SamSam or SamAs.
Yeah, I remember Sam. That's right.
That actually was tied back to some Iranians, and that was the first what we would call enterprise ransomware. In fact, when that hit, I remember it was probably May 2016. I actually testified before the Senate Judiciary about the fact that ransomware is coming, and we're starting to see it targeting enterprises, and this is a big issue. And I remember at the time, I think it was the Senate Judiciary. I think it was Sheldon Whitehouse, and
It's a convenient last name.
I forgot who the other guy was, but it was bipartisan, and they were both kind of like, "What are you like? Is this a thing?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's a thing." And
Is this really happening?
yeah, and then shortly after that, the first major kind of botnet operator, right? So up until about 2016, the big e-crime thing was always kind of botnets. So you had stuff like TrickBot, and you had Dridex, and they were, again, focused on stealing bank account information and credit card information, and they were kind of along the lines of things like Jabberzeus, which was trying to steal two-factor authentication to bypass two-factor authentication, which was first becoming prevalent around that time frame as well. And those became kind of the big e-crime threat for a while there. And right around that 2016, 2017 time frame, the first evidence that I remember was BitPaymer, which was the ransomware deployed by Dridex. And this is all part of what is called Evil Core.
Yeah.
Maxim Yakubits was the main kind of guy associated with that, and OFAC sanctioned them, and there were all these things that happened. But the first ransomware that hit an enterprise and really made big news was BitPaymer, and it hit a National Health Service somewhere in I think Scotland or the UK. And when that happened, I think it was like a $10,000 ransom payment or something along those lines. And
This
that
I'm
was
sure was massive headlines in contrast to like Crypto Locker was asking for like $300, right?
Yeah.
And they were very consumer targeted, right? It's like home
Yeah.
users and so forth. So that major jump of seeing a ransomware or a piece of ransomware asking for $300, now, evolving into a $10,000 payment against an enterprise. I'm sure that was game changing. Well, did they pay? Did the healthcare provider actually pay that? Or what was the result of that?
I think they might have. I don't recall exactly, but there was that was like the first one that really kind of caught everybody's attention.
Yeah.
And then we started seeing these routine $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 ransom demands from BitPaymer associated with Dridex. SamSam kind of started to go away around that time frame. And then TrickBot was, which we track as Wizard Spider, was the other big player doing account takeover and wire fraud and stuff like that. And then they started deploying ransomware as well. The Wizard Spider was using initially the Ryuk.
That's right. That's right.
And then they moved into some other stuff, Conti and stuff like that later. But that was their first kind of major thing was they were deploying Ryuk through TrickBot. With Dridex and TrickBot, these were both very heavy kind of, it was overkill almost for what they were doing at that time frame. So these were the major ransomware, or I should say major e-crime gangs, transitioning from their comprehensive implant of Dridex or TrickBot that was used for lots of different things, and then they started using that to deliver ransomware. And so that kind of became the first iteration of the major ransomware, right? So think of that ransomware phase 2 after targeting consumers for a couple of $100. Then they went after enterprises, and we started seeing those big e-crime gangs getting involved in the ransomware game. And then at some point, the Dridex crew had a disagreement, and they actually split. They forked all of their code base. So we found something, the fork of Dridex, which we called Dridex. And then they had a Doppel version of the ransomware. So it was Doppelpaymer. And then we called it Spider. But that gang actually liked the name. I guess they must have read our blog post or something. So they then called it Dridex or Doppelpaymer was the name that they were using. And that was another iteration of kind of that old guard of e-crime actors kind of getting into that ransomware game. And probably around 2017, 2018 was the first ransomware as a service that we started to see. And this kind of changed that whole model of you have this kind of monolithic gang that does, end to end all of the things. And GandCrab was the first big one that I remember, at least, that came out, and I guess send some comments if you know of another one beyond GandCrab that was the first ransomware as a service. But GandCrab, which is what we associate with Pinchy Spider, Pinchy Spider named because of crab, right? And that they did that for a while, and they also had a name of like Soda no Kibi, or I think was the name of it.
I'm not going to try to pronounce that one, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right. But then, and then, after kind of GandCrab, they were successful for a couple of months, and then they kind of retired, and they were like, oh, we had a lot of fun, we made a lot of money, but we're going to retire now. And shortly after, Our Evil came out. And when Our Evil came out, that was so close in code to GandCrab, we actually were able to link the two together in the first iteration. And so we associated Our Evil with Pinchy Spider, who's...
Can we pause here for a second? Because this evolution is interesting, right? You talked about associating the source code of GandCrab to this new version, but if we go back to Ryuk, right? I know we actually published a blog about this back in, I think, 2018, 2019, on the source code for Ryuk tied to the Hermes ransomware family, and it looks like there were other iterations of ransomware that were developed off of the Hermes ransomware source code, which to me sounds like there's probably a very small handful of individuals actually building these families, and then everyone is creating an iteration of it, or it's led to the ransomware as a service where they're just doing it really well, and they figured they could monetize building the ransomware or the ransomware as a service platform now.
Well, Hermes, I think, was associated with Ryuk.
With Ryuk specifically, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so we had initially tracked Hermes as its own thing that we tracked as Grim Spider, and then we were subsequently able to link that back together with Ryuk. And a lot of them kind of came out of those e-crime ecosystems where they were selling code bases to each other and stuff like that.
Yeah. But it sounds like now, in lieu of selling the code base, they're just saying just subscribe to this platform, if you will, right?
Well, so that was I think the innovation with GandCrab was basically, and he started seeing that they would kind of advertise the platform. So this basically meant you didn't have to build your own ransomware. And
Exactly.
this persists today, right? There's
Yeah.
lots of different ransomware as a services out there. But the innovation there was basically we will build the platform for the negotiation of payment. For a while, those were open. You could actually go into any of the victims' chat with the threat actor
Yeah.
and see the negotiation for payment. And all you had to do was kind of find the sample. And then they moved away from that and they moved to using emails, these disposable emails to do the negotiation as well. But that ransomware as a service was innovative because then it said, okay, you are an e-criminal or an aspiring e-criminal. If you demonstrate that you have the skills and we can vet you a little bit, then you can use our ransomware as a service. And this means that you are responsible for deploying the ransomware and encrypting the systems. And then we will handle it from there, right? We handle all the key management, which is kind of problematic because if you can't decrypt the file and people start talking about that, then your ransomware isn't ever going to get payment. So they needed to actually demonstrate that they could decrypt the files. So that key management was an important part of ransomware as a service, the negotiation platform, the ability to just kind of create a new build for every victim that you target. That's all kind of that innovation as the ransomware as a service. And this corresponded, largely with all the software industry moving to SaaS. So, they were kind of seeing the prevalence of SaaS and the utility of SaaS and kind of applied that to the ransomware e-crime game. And then you as an aspiring e-criminal, all you had to do is demonstrate that you had some skills and they would let you use their ransomware. And then depending on how much money you made, it was kind of a revenue sharing model where, if you were new to the game and you were kind of an unvetted person, then they would do a 30-70 split with you and you would get, 70%, they would take 30%. But as you did more volume with them, they actually, started to dial that back. So it would be more of a, close to, I think the best we'd seen was probably like a 15-85 split. And so that kind of became the prevalent model, which we still see today, where you have these kind of ransomware as a services out there that you can kind of split. And then probably around 2019, just leading up into the pandemic, was when we started to see that double extortion model, where they would also do data exfil.
Exactly.
And then they started doing naming and shaming with what we call a DLS or dedicated leaks site.
Sure.
And what that entailed was I would break in, theoretically, steal a bunch of data, deploy ransomware, and then threaten to release that data and also have the ransomware. So there was kind of a bit of a progression. And then we saw a couple of threat actors playing around with just data extortion where they didn't even deploy ransomware.
Sure, they just stole it and just warned you, said, hey, I have your data. Now you're susceptible to these fines if this is leaked, and now you're going to pay me $5 million in lieu of the $10 million fine that you're basically going to face if this goes public, right?
Yeah, exactly. GDPR and stuff like that was
exactly
those ransom notes as well.
That's fascinating. I remember also we didn't really talk about like Lockbit, right? But I noticed that as these groups become almost like micro e-crime startups, right? I remember Lockbit 3.0 even had like a bug bounty program at one point where they were looking for folks to identify issues with their payment sites and the ransomware itself. And so these guys are actually getting, to your point, I think you hit it on the head, their OPSEC is increasing substantially and they're treating these businesses like full-fledged enterprises, right?
Well, I mean, they're making incredible money. I mean,
Yeah,
we just
exactly.
saw the indictment of Thuber, who is also known as Brad or Brad Band from Scattered Spider, one of the main kind of principal people behind that. And I think they said it was over $100 million.
Yeah, that's right.
He had made and across, was it like 40 or 70 or something like that, victims over a pretty short period of time. And again, that was ransomware as a service. So as we look at where this is going, maybe we'll talk about that in a few minutes. We could go down into kind of where we got to look at where we've been to know where we're going. But what they were doing was they were really good at gaining access through voice-based phishing and getting into SharePoint and things like that to find configuration information and getting into single sign-on and then getting into hypervisors. And hypervisors, that became a huge target probably around 2020. It was when we started really seeing threat actors going after hypervisors. It still persists today.
Yeah.
The other thing that we've been seeing too more recently is NetBIOS or things like that, where they're actually encrypting over the network. So they're not actually even touching the host. They're just encrypting the files on the network.
Yeah. Oh, that's
And
fascinating.
of course, probably around 2019 timeframe was when we started seeing a real effort to disable shadow volume copies and doing
That's right.
anything to go after backups to disrupt the ability for an organization to recover, because they knew that there's this economic model with ransomware, and this is why they heavily target things like manufacturing and healthcare. And in 2019, for a while, they were also heavily targeting school districts.
Yeah, I remember
2019,
that. Yeah.
2021, because they were looking for organizations that had this kind of imperative to be up and running. In manufacturing, if your systems are down, you can measure that downtime in dollars and cents. And they knew that at some point, the cost benefit analysis of it would be cheaper to pay the ransom and get back up and running than to continue to fight through this and try to recover from backup,
Hmm.
because pulling backups out of cold storage and stuff like that takes time and it takes effort. And when you're under pressure and you're under the gun, it can be real difficult to get that done.
You have a bit of a panic response too on the healthcare side and even the school district side. We've seen instances where school districts had systems locked down and like emergency doors were shut and folks couldn't get into certain
Voice over
rooms.
IP
That's
systems,
right. Everything taken
and
over.
parents can't call up, and you can imagine that school districts had a huge challenge when parents couldn't get through on the phone lines and the
Yeah.
schools were closed. I remember right in the pandemic, there was a school district that got hit by ransomware just as they were going to remote learning, and they
That's
actually had
right.
to postpone the remote learning because they had been hit by ransomware.
I do remember this. So where are we going then? Like, what's the next iteration of this? Because this evolution, it's fascinating. What we've seen is where everything maybe have started out with a floppy, right, with a $189 payment. Now we're talking about ransomware as a service platforms. We're talking about millions, tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars that are being accumulated over the course of years from these groups that are being very
I'd say
sophisticated,
it's
right?
above hundreds of millions. I'd say
Right.
we're
So probably in the billions, right, at this point. Yeah. So what does it look like then moving forward, right? What does the evolution of ransomware look like in today and then going tomorrow?
one of my big concerns right now is, and we've kind of looked very closely at scattered spider, right? That's been a huge problem for the industry over the last 3 years or so.
Yeah.
And what was really kind of unique about that is it was Westerners. It was not the usual suspects of Eastern
Yeah.
European
Yeah.
e-crime actors. This was Westerners, and we started digging into the who's behind some of these attacks, and what we found was this kind of radicalization pipeline where it started off with gamers, right, doing these kind of online games, kids, right, 13, 14-year-old kids. And one of the things that emerged from that was this concept of griefers.
Yeah, that's
And a
right.
griefer is kind of somebody that goes into the game, and their goal is to just ruin the experience for other people for their own
Yeah.
amusement, right? It's really antisocial behavior. And when they go from that, then the next iteration of antisocial behavior was they started kind of looking for these coveted usernames, right? What we would call an OG username. Imagine if you were Christian on Twitter, right? That would be a pretty cool Twitter handle.
That would.
And they were looking at these games and looking at these handles, early handles that would be really cool to have. And they started doing phishing attacks against the people that had those handles so that they could steal the handle and take it as their own. And that was kind of bragging rights, right? Then you could kind of flash your new handle, and there's really no recourse for the victim in that case. And then from there, they kind of use those skills that they had developed to do identity theft, and they started targeting cryptocurrency holders. So the same
Mhm.
techniques applied, right? Phishing them. That's where they started getting into multi-factor authentication bypasses, particularly SMS multi-factor. And that's where they started developing the skills to call the telcos and to call the business process outsourcers and use that to start doing SIM swapping. Scattered Spider, for example, was trying to do SIM swapping as a service for a while before they got into ransomware. And then when they realized that that wasn't going to pay off, or they weren't able to maintain persistent access to do SIM swapping as a service, they pivoted into ransomware. And they actually used initially Alpha V because that was one of the members there, this guy Jack, had previously worked or knew how to use Alpha V. And so back in April 2023, first ransomware we saw from that group was them using Alpha V to target, I think it was the SXI actually.
Yeah.
As we think about where this is all going, Scattered Spider is just one story of that radicalization from online gaming to ransomware. I think what we've seen now, what we've uncovered, is that there's a whole culture of this, right? And
Oh,
we've
wow.
all heard the COM, or the community, which is kind of a pretty diverse ecosystem of antisocial kind of people that are doing either criminal activity, violence as a service, or that type of behavior. And because there's an ecosystem, then we found a lot of them flashing their ill-gotten gains on places like Instagram and
Yeah,
things
I've
like
seen
that.
that.
So they're kind of showing off what they got from it. So where this is going, I think my big concern for the future is that we have this kind of emerging teenage hacker group in the West, and they've gotten really good at social engineering, voice-based phishing. They've kind of dialed in how to target identities. And we start to see the places where they're operating, some of the traditional e-crime actors from Eastern Europe coming in and kind of mingling with them. The next thing that I'm really kind of concerned about on the horizon is the combination of the e-crime actors from Eastern Europe
Influencing, right?
Yeah.
This growing if you will, right?
Or using it,
We're
right?
using, oh yeah.
They start figuring out a way to monetize what those kids are doing on the identity side, and then they're the ones deploying the ransomware, which might be a bridge too far for some of these Western kids that they see what happened to Scattered Spider, and they're like, I'm not going to do ransomware because that's how you go to jail. And so then they just become a cog in that wheel of ransomware as these kind of Eastern European e-crime actors move away from trying traditional, right? One of the things we didn't talk about was how these things got deployed. So there's a whole ecosystem of e-crime. And in that ecosystem, you have things like malware, pay per install, right? So they have a botnet like SmokeLoader or something like that, or Emotet, or something that has kind of the pay per install capability. And then they pay that botnet to deploy their tools. And one of the things that the Dridex crew and the TrickBot crew, Inject Spider, Wizard Spider, kind of pivoted into is they realized that Dridex was detectable or TrickBot was detectable. And it was really heavy and it was difficult to maintain. And it had all of this functionality and features that they really didn't need. So then they started diversifying how they were deploying their ransomware. And instead of using kind of a pay per install to deploy TrickBot to deploy BitPaymer, then they moved into, let's just start using these lightweight loaders. And they started using a lightweight loader that could be deployed through malicious email or something like that. And then it was disposable effectively. So if it got caught and antivirus started detecting it, they could modify it or just move on to a completely different loader.
Yeah.
And we started seeing them playing with kind of moving from everything being done in C or Delphi, and they started moving towards things like Rust and Golang, and they kind of diversified what coding languages they were using, because when you were building tools with these different coding languages, the profile of that binary is very different, and it could be used to evade detection. And so that was kind of one of the things that they were doing for a while was trying to diversify the code base so that they could avoid detection that would then allow them to load the ransomware that they wanted to load.
What you've described sounds eerily similar to how most enterprises manage software distribution, right? You have a team that's focused on change management controls, deploying, or rather putting a tool on these systems to get software onto different machines. So name your software distribution tool that's out there. And then there's things like updates and patching. Every group in an enterprise responsible for those different capabilities. And it sounds like the crime ecosystem is following kind of a similar siloed approach to everything from the loaders themselves, the distribution of ransomware, the data extortion, the access brokers, like you name it, right? And I know that, again, we referenced this in an older episode. There's a fantastic graphic that your team put together and what the e-crime ecosystem looks like. Everything from like money mules to like you name it, right? I thought it was fascinating. I've used it plenty of times in a lot of public speaking engagements. I think it's an older image, but so
it's a global threat
valid.
report, I think like 2022 or something.
It might have been like 2021 or 22, exactly. But it's still just so relevant.
We did do a few versions of it because it changed.
It changed, yeah, but the foundation is still so relevant, right?
Yeah.
Even if you were to use the old one, it's still relevant. It still breaks down ransomware as a service operators, the access brokers. It's just fantastic. And so, I'd love to see a new version.
That ecosystem, it's interesting because what the ransomware as a service people are advertising in some of these forums when they're trying to recruit people to deploy their ransomware, because that's how they make money, right? You're a user of theirs, and they're going to generate revenue from that. And so the advertisements were looking for pen testers, is what they called the people that would actually gain access and deploy the ransomware for them. And that became a whole ecosystem in and of itself. And it was ransomware paint by numbers, where if you're a young aspiring e-criminal in Eastern Europe, you don't need to do all the things, right? So you could use pay per install to get something deployed, and then you can get a ransomware as a service, and you just have to kind of stitch it together to be able to get the ransomware deployed, and then you get paid.
The reason I brought up the analogy in comparison to an enterprise is because I think enterprises can do a better job of just working closer together, right? And not necessarily being, we've seen it so many times where there's someone that's very standoffish, like, hey, I run endpoint management and you're not going to get this onto these systems until this goes through a very vetting process. And we've seen these e-crime groups just collaborating so effectively, right? With their common goal of doing something malicious. And I think there's a really great opportunity for us to even look at the way that they work together and become, as a community, a little more tightly knit. So,
yeah, for sure. And we're seeing advances. They're using Gen AI in some cases. One of the ones that I kind of point to as an early example is FunkLocker, where I think we've talked about that in the past with some of our Gen AI stuff. But that is one of the kind of steps that we're starting to see. And I think the other thing that I could see happening at some point in the not too distant future would be, as these models get smaller and smaller, you could imagine a point in time where an AI algorithm is baked into some sort of a tool so that they can interact with it. And instead of having to pre-bake all of the functionality and capabilities that they want.
Oh, interesting.
Right. You can imagine it's got maybe an onboard Python interpreter or PowerShell interpreter or something like that. Or maybe it just pipes straight into PowerShell. Yeah. And then you say to the LLM that's on board the tool, profile the system. And then, and we've seen that with LameHug, which is Fancy Bear, and it doesn't have it on board. It actually calls out to the Hugging Face API in order to do that. But you can imagine, as these models get smaller and smaller, it's just a matter of time before somebody kind of bakes one in to one of these tools and they start using that for malicious purposes.
That's fascinating. More to come on that. Any final suggestions for enterprises on, protecting against ransomware? I know that we've been talking about identities being used as an entry point. Adversaries aren't hacking in, they're logging in. Yeah. But I think ransomware is still something to be concerned about, right? Just given the nature of the evolution. So any closing comments for listeners?
We're probably on the precipice in the next 3 to 9 months here of an explosion of vulnerabilities. Google had I think it was called the Big Sleep program, where they were able to use AI to find and develop vulnerabilities into exploits. Yeah. And I played with that a little bit myself, not with Big Sleep, but just orchestrating a few different LLM type agents together to analyze Git repos and to look for vulnerabilities in Git repos. So this takes the cost of a vulnerability, which, go back a couple of years, we were talking about vulnerabilities costing hundreds of thousands or up to $1 million for a really nice 0 day. And the cost of that goes down dramatically. Yeah. And even not just a 0 day, but this, an end day, which is there's a vulnerability that's known and there's a patch available, but the window between when enterprises apply that patch and when the vulnerability is discovered.
Exactly. The gap between like discovery versus like when the patch is applied. Yeah.
Yeah, but if you take a look at any vulnerability write-up, potentially you could take a detailed blog post about a vulnerability. There's a patch available for it, but it's not widely patched. Sure. And you can get an LLM to help you build a proof of concept for that. And so this really kind of lowers the cost for the vulnerability side of things. Yeah. So I think organizations really need to take this opportunity now to dial in patch management and figure out what is a prioritization for patching. Because a lot of organizations that I've talked to, they kind of go based off severity. So they look at the CVSS score of
the vulnerability itself. Exactly. Yeah.
And they're like, oh, this is at a threshold of 8.5, let's say. Anything above 8.5, we break glass and we do an emergency patch. Anything less than that, we're not. And what we found, we talked about this in the Global Threat Report, is chaining of vulnerabilities together. So you could have two vulnerabilities that might be lower severity, or one that's lower severity and one that's higher severity, but it's a local privilege escalation. Yeah. And enterprises look at each vulnerability
individually. Exactly.
Yeah. So they're like, oh, well, this is 8.5, but it's an LPE. So it's not a huge deal because you'd have to have access to the system.
Exactly.
But they're also ignoring the fact that there was a, unauthenticated remote access that was a 5.5. So if you combine those two things together, it's a kill shot. Yeah. So this is where something like CISA has the known exploited vulnerabilities, or KEV. Yeah. And that's a really good way to start thinking about patching, not based off of severity. Or the other very prevalent way people think about patching is how much of a vulnerability exists, or prevalence of a vulnerability in the environment.
Exactly.
But I think the real answer is that organizations should start to move towards an adversary use approach, right? So which vulnerabilities are actively being exploited, and let's patch those first and prioritize that.
Agreed. I think that's fantastic. I think also even looking at things like misconfigurations of systems and mapping that to that exploit chaining concept you just mentioned, and then overlaying adversary intelligence on top of that, I think that just kind of rounds out that program.
That's critical. And then identity threat detection and response, because as adversaries more and more, we saw from voice-based phishing, as we've talked about, 442% increase in 2024. It's on track to double in 2025.
Oh, wow.
More and more adversaries targeting those identities so that they can log in. You need to have identity threat detection and response in place, right? You need to be able to scattered spider. The last iteration, I think, with Scattered Spider, they did a bunch of work to gain access. So think of that as kind of left of boom.
Yeah.
But once they gained access, within 30 seconds, they provisioned an additional multi-factor authentication device. Within a minute and a half of that, they deleted the email telling the user that a new multi-factor authentication device had been provisioned. And within another minute or so after that, they were into the single sign-on and into
the victim system, right? Yeah.
Or Azure or whatever it was.
Yeah.
That's less than 4 minutes. Then they're logging in as a legitimate user, and they're deep in the org. So in addition to having the vulnerability and patch management, you need to have that identity threat detection and response. And then the other side of that, they're heavily targeting ESXi and hypervisors, which today there's really no EDR that you could put onto that.
Yeah.
So using stuff like Next-Gen SIEM lets you start to pull the logs out of those legacy or unmanaged systems to include vSphere and ESXi. And now you can start to kind of allow your threat hunters and your SOC analysts to be able to pull together those threads of like, oh, this authentication event happened, and then a new VM was created inside of the hypervisor tied to that account.
You have a much better timeline, like a really good timeline of the anatomy of the attack, and as it's happening, right? And so then you can start to put compensating controls and better MFA enforcement, and to your point, identity-based policies that look for anomalous activity or behaviors, authentication, locations. I mean, there's so much that we can do around building that story in a timeline that is going to match the speed of the adversary, right?
100%. And as you start to kind of evolve your defense to kind of counter these emergent threats, it really comes down to having cross-domain visibility, because these adversaries are not confined to one domain of endpoint and server. They're using identity, they're using cloud, they're using 136% increase in cloud intrusion in the last year. So as they start to move into those other domains, you can't just have your threat hunters and your SOC analysts looking down a straw. You need to have that aperture expanded so that they could see the breadcrumbs and they could see the cloud breadcrumbs and start to tie those things together.
Well said, sir. All right, you heard it here. Cross-domain visibility, absolutely important. This evolution of ransomware is, I think, fascinating. I would love to have someone from the FBI or law enforcement talk a little bit about indictments and the ripple effect of what these indictments look like across the e-crime ecosystem.
DOJ, if you're a U.S. attorney out there and you want to talk to us about any of this stuff, let us know. Happy to host you on the pod here, and or any law enforcement that wants to have that conversation, let us know, because this is where industry and law enforcement and government really need to come together to help start to counter these things a little bit more effectively. So
I love that.
It can start with a conversation.
Yeah, love that. Oh, we can start with a conversation. We should get t-shirts that say that.
We've got a backlog of t-shirt ideas.
I know. There's like 47 of them right in a notepad somewhere. Awesome. Well, you heard it here on the Adversary Universe podcast. Adam, thank you so much. We'll catch everyone on the next episode. Appreciate all the support. Our listeners, we love the feedback. We love the emails, the LinkedIn messages that we're getting.
And we love seeing you all out there at Adversary Underground. We did a live event at Falcon again this year.
Thank you so much.
We had 800 people there.
That's right, 800 folks showed up.
Out the door, and
it's great.
I think that was pretty. That's pretty big for a live podcast.
There's great feedback overall. So awesome. So the next episode of the Adversary Universe podcast, great content coming in. Don't want to ruin the surprise. We'll catch you on the next episode.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe to our podcast and head over to crowdstrike.com/adversaries to learn more about the many bad guys we track. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Adversary Universe podcast.